I'm Mike Costello, and I'd like to talk to you in the next few minutes about putting your life back together. Have you ever felt like your life was just broken, like things were happening that were beyond your control? Of course you have. We all have. From time to time, challenges come into every life experience. Sometimes things seem to be going so well in our lives. Our family is happy, our job is great, and things are going along just wonderfully. And then all of a sudden, something happens. Someone says something, something is done, and your whole feeling about life changes. The pieces of your life seem to fall apart, and it seems that you're in the midst of a broken and unhappy situation. So often when we get into these circumstances and situations, into these feelings within our lives, we feel that there's no way out, and it seems that there's kind of a downward spiral, and we just go down, down, down. And then at some point in time, we either get tired of going down, 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 or something happens within us, something is said to us, a thought process begins, a little process of changing the way that we think about circumstances and situations, and we begin to come up out of that downward spiral. And as we come up out of that downward spiral, life begins to go back together again. Things come together and we see happiness again. Over and over in our lives, we are challenged to deal with this upward and downward movement. The reality is that all of us have these experiences. All of us have these feelings. Even though we would like to feel elated and on the mountaintop at all times, that simply is not the way. But we do believe that we live in our minds and not in the world. That means that we live in this world and we experience the circumstances and situations that come to us. But we believe that there is something greater and more magnificent that transcends the physical experiences, and that is the spiritual dimension and reality of our consciousness and our awareness. Regardless of what you believe, regardless of your religious tradition, you have the ability, you have the right to change your way of thinking about the circumstances and situations of life. When you're challenged in life, when things occur and happen and you begin the downward spiral, it is in your mind and in your heart that you can grasp on to something that will sustain and empower you to shift that downward spiral and begin the process of rising up. When we face the circumstances of life, of moving in that downward spiral, coming down into depression, having our life broken apart, one of the things that we need to do is to accept the reality of where we are. That's not always easy, to accept the reality of where we are, because where we are at a given point may not be where we want to be. Feeling the way that we do may not be the way that we want to feel. But coming to a point of understanding and realizing that that's where we are is the beginning point of stopping the downward spiral. We need to face our losses, face our mistakes, and face our shortcomings. We need to deal with the reality of who we are and where we are at any given time in our life. If you are sick, you are sick. If you are sad, you are sad. If you are depressed, you are depressed. It doesn't mean that you have to stay there. It doesn't even mean that where you are has to affect totally the way that you feel inside. But you must, we all must, accept the reality of where we are. And as we do that, things begin to happen. We begin to be empowered. We begin to be directed. We begin to be guided in new ways of thought. And as we're guided in new ways of thought, we're directed into action that can change our lives. We believe in the connectiveness between divine mind and our human mind. That means that the infinite intelligence of God is constantly in contact with you and with me and with all of the people that inhabit this planet. Has nothing to do with belief, has nothing to do with religion. It has simply to do with the spiritual reality that God connects and embraces all of His children everywhere. When we believe and understand that concept, we then have access to the divine mind of God, which can bring to us the solutions that we need in the midst of our circumstances and situations that pull us down, down in life. We have to be willing to accept the way things are. We have to be willing to accept life as it is. When we do that, we stop the spiral, and we're able at that point to center ourselves in the conscious reality that God's mind and our minds are connected. And at that point, we can have the inspiration of wonderful and magnificent ideas. In your life, when you've had the most difficult challenges of your life, when have you found the solutions? Where have the answers come? When you were working so hard to understand a problem, to seek out an answer? Sometimes, but not usually. Usually the answers to our most perplexing problems come when we least expect it. When we step out of the experience, out of the problem, and get ourselves into neutral, if you will. It might be while we're standing in the shower. It might be while you're washing dishes. It might be while you're driving the car. In most cases, it's when your mind is cleared of the problem, when your mind is not focused on the problem or difficulty that you face, whether it's an illness, a limit of income, a relationship that's a problem, whatever it is that you face that's a difficulty, when you seek the solution, your consciousness and your awareness is directed on the problem, not on the solution. But if we move our sight from the problem, accept it as a reality, that that's the way it is, this is where I am, we can then begin the process of opening ourselves as channels to the guidance and direction of divine inspiration, and that, we say, is the connectiveness between divine mind and your human mind. It's available to you, it's available to me, it's available to all people. We don't need to learn it, we don't need to do anything to justify it, we don't need to do anything to obtain it. It is already there. What we do need to do is to step out of the way when our problems and challenges seem to overshadow our thinking and allow the mind of God to speak to our hearts. Our fellowship was founded in 1926 by Dr. Eugene Garlic and his wife Hattie. And Hattie lived to be 96 years old. She lived a happy and a full life, but she was faced, like you and me and all people, with difficulties and challenges. When she was 89 years old, she fell and broke her hip. Kind of a common thing for older people, but this was in the 1970s. So you can imagine how devastating that was. In that period of time, while great strides had been made in medicine, many, many elderly people who fell and broke their hips didn't survive. Today they do. She fell and broke her hip. She went to the hospital, had the hip replaced, went to a nursing home. For most people, the expectation would be that that was the end of Hattie Garlic. Her mind was always centered on the reality of this basic teaching, of accepting things the way they were. When she fell and broke her hip, she fell and broke her hip. She was 89 years old. She knew she was 89 years old. But in the midst of this circumstance and situation, she moved herself and her thinking from the problem and said, if I'm not to recover, if I'm not to go home, then that's where I am and that's what I will accept. She did recover. She did go home. She got around and everyone was very happy. 2 years later, when she was 91 years old, she fell and broke the other hip. For most people, that would have been a very devastating experience, would have been the end of her. Hattie approached this situation in exactly the same way. She accepted what had happened to her, she accepted what could happen, and she centered herself in the presence of God and said, whatever I'm guided and directed to do, whatever I'm empowered and strengthened to do, that's what I'll do, and that's how I'll live. And in the midst of both of these experiences, she was positive, she was affirming, even in the midst of a situation that normally would have caused someone to go down, down, down into the depths of despair and hopelessness. Her centering presence was in the reality of accepting things the way they are, but denying the fact that the way things are have to be the way I think about them. Simply because she was told that most people at 89 and 91 die with their hips, she knew that was a possibility. She did not deny that possibility, but she moved beyond it, and she accepted the fact that she believed and she claimed and she was directed and guided to overcome that circumstance and situation. There's a story that's told of a prospector who had a mule, and he loved this mule very, very much, and they'd been out in the desert for many, many years together. And there was an abandoned well, and it had been covered over by boards, and the old mule somehow stumbled on to the well, stood on the boards that were covering it, and the boards broke, and the mule fell into the hole. The prospector was an elderly gentleman. He didn't know what to do. He went to the edge of the well, and he looked down, and he saw his mule, and there was the mule in the bottom. He had no equipment. He was limited in his physical strength, and the mule looked to be dead, so he didn't know what to do. So in his despair, he decided, the mule is dead, and the only thing that I can do is bury him so that the buzzards and animals won't get to him, and that's the last thing that I can do for this good and dear friend that I've had for so long. So the prospector began the process of filling his shovel and shoveling dirt into the hole, and this went on for hours and hours, and the sun began to set. And as the sun began to set and the hours had passed, the prospector looked over into the hole, and up out of the hole came the mule. The mule had been awakened by the dirt that was thrown on his back. And as the dirt was thrown level by level, shovel by shovel on his back, the mule stood at the bottom and shook it off his back, put it under his feet, and allowed himself to rise up out of the well. Did that really happen? I don't know. But the story speaks to us deeply of our need to deal with the situations in our lives, much like that mule did. Things happen to us. Difficulties come. And when they come upon our shoulders and upon our heads and upon our hearts, and they burden us, we are challenged to shake them off, to put them under our feet. And as we do that, we're able to rise above the circumstance and situation. Maybe we won't be able to overcome. Maybe we won't be totally victorious in the way that we think we should be. But the reality is that we are spiritual beings in a physical experience, and the physical experiences of our life do not truly touch us unless we allow them to. And the spiritual strength that we have within our hearts and our minds can empower us to be victorious overcomers in the midst of our most difficult circumstance. You are worthy, I am worthy. All of us as children of God are worthy of the love and the light and the truth that God brings to us. That truth empowers us and strengthens us regardless of circumstance or situation. If we believe that we are worthy children of God, and truly we are, then we always have available to us the inspiration and the divine guidance of infinite intelligence and that divine mind that I spoke about a minute ago. Serenity comes from within. I don't know what you face today. I don't know what you'll face tomorrow. I don't know what I will face tomorrow. But I know that whatever I face and whatever you face, that we, all of us, as members of the human race, all of us as children of God, are empowered and strengthened to deal with whatever happens in our lives. But we can only deal with what happens if we accept where we are and claim who and what we are. And when we do that, the serenity and the peace and the power is resident within our heart, within our mind, and radiates to our entire being. We believe in prayer as a centering and healing force, as a unifying power. So we'd like to invite you at this point in the program to pause for a moment of prayer and reflection with us. Eternal God, we gather our hearts and minds together as we remember those who are facing difficulties and challenges in daily life. And we see beyond the appearance of difficulty, we see beyond the brokenness, the mistakes, the shortcomings, and we see the true radiant light of each one as a perfect and whole child of God. We see each other in that way, and we enfold and encircle ourselves in your divine presence and love, in the name of faith, in the name of hope, in the name of love. Amen.
Those were wonderful examples of triumph over adversity, triumph of the human spirit, the animal spirit over adversity. And you always give examples that show that indeed ordinary circumstances will help us to conquer adversity. Just being ourselves and getting in touch with that divine within, with God the whole, is the answer. That the answer always lies within us.
The answer always lies within us, and we don't need to run away from the experiences of life. I think whether we're religious people or spiritual people or non-believers, many people believe that their lives will be happy if they simply have no problems, if they have no difficulties, that if there's some magic way that we can be faithful to God or we can learn something, or I don't know, any number of things that people think that can avoid challenges and problems and illness. But the reality is that those things are a part of the human condition. And I believe they're created by God for a good and right purpose, and that we grow through those experiences. The example that we give so often is the mathematician. If you have a mathematician who's just good at what he or she does, they solve a horrific problem that I would never be able to even begin to comprehend. And after they spend hours or days solving one problem, their colleagues bring them another, and they just thrive on the problems of life. And I think that truly spiritual people do that. We don't thrive on the problem, but we thrive in the overcoming of the difficulties and adversities, and we thrive if we can share with others the ability to deal with adversity in that way, because adversity is a part of life.
There's the answer, and that's why we're here. You often talk of the law of cause and effect, and if we didn't have problems to face, then we wouldn't need be here, because we're here to grow through specific problems and to grow spiritually by growing through those specific problems.
Right. One of the analogies that's given very often is that in New Thought, we believe that life, physical life on the earth plane, is the school for the soul. And so all of the experiences that we have in the physical sense are spiritual lessons for us. And some of us are learning to be overcomers.
Yes. And if we don't learn one way, we learn another, because that's why we're here, to learn those. And when some of the ways we can be more in touch with our own inner peace is through meditation. And of course, through prayer. Through prayer, we're talking to God. Through meditation, we're listening. And we need both in our lives. And we need to know that the answers are within us, and they can come to us.
Prayer and meditation are tremendous centering forces when we're in that situation that I was speaking about, where we feel that life is pulling us down and where there's great, great difficulty, or if we're facing an illness, a limit, a lack.
That was a wonderful story about the donkey who stepped on his problems and rose to the top. That's a wonderful example, and we can all take that to heart.
Yeah. And his option was to simply lay there and let them bury him
Exactly.
and die. But you know, the problem with death is, and of course we believe that life is eternal, so
Yes.
dying doesn't solve the problem.
It doesn't solve that problem.
Does not. And so we're still going to have the problems. And until we become victorious overcomers, until we claim who and what we really are, we're going to continue to live through these experiences.
Yes, and use our problems as stepping stones. It's just like if we got a lemon, make lemonade. And there's a lot of different analogies we can use. But the bottom line is, and you said it so beautifully, that we need to just know that we're going to face problems and then look to the answers within ourselves.
Very important to also claim where we are. I think that in New Thought, we have a lot of people who don't want us to claim where we are, and they have great difficulty with our teaching in that area. And some people have even said that our particular teaching is inconsistent with the mainstream of New Thought. Mm-hmm. That may be. I think that New Thought does make some denial of circumstance and situation in life in some schools, mm-hmm. Christian Science and some of the others. But I believe that when we are sick, just as I said, we are sick.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that the sickness has to have power over us. It doesn't negate the reality of spiritual healing, which we believe, which we teach. But it does mean that we begin from where we are, and then we deny the power that that has over us. Not that we deny that it happens.
Yeah.
If we're sick, we can't say we're not sick. We can say that the sickness does not touch us. We can say that we are well, the true us is well, but the physical body is indeed sick.
Yes. Well, faith without works is dead, and I think that's the bottom line of the people who just affirm. And they say, I affirm this and I affirm that, and if they don't work to affirm toward what they're affirming, then it's just an affirmation.
True. And what they're affirming is the reality of this power or force over them, rather than the force itself.
Yes. So we need to look to the divine, to have our answers, and then follow through with work in that way, just like Mrs. Garlic did. She didn't give up. That was a very wonderful example of the human spirit not being defeated. And that lady was not young, 89 years old, and to have a broken hip and then to conquer that and then go on and have the other hip broken, she was really tested, but she didn't give up. Her spirit stayed strong.
And it was how she felt about what had happened. She accepted what had happened, but she denied the reality that that circumstance would have control over how she felt.
Yes.
So she was going to be at peace and she was going to be serene regardless.
Yeah.
An example is a lady in our church whom you know that is older and decided that she was going to stop driving. And she just decided that it was time that she stopped driving and gave up her car and started taking the bus. Has been very peaceful about it and very happy
Yeah.
and very fulfilled. And many of her contemporaries have said to her, and I have been involved in those conversations, when they've said, well, how could you give up your car? You gave up your mobility. You accepted the fact that you're old. Well, their thinking and her thinking are totally different.
Exactly.
Her thinking was, it was time, I can no longer do this,
Yeah.
and maybe it's not safe anymore, plus it's a major expense, so I'll simply take the bus. Yet some of her friends who are so dependent upon their cars, if they had to give up their cars, would go into deep depression.
Yes.
And would never come out of it. So.
And she stayed happy because she rationalized truly that, well, one, she would have more spendable funds, and two, someone else can do the driving, like the advertisements say. And so she had lots of advantages there. And this, I know when people are ill and face other problems, and such as that lady, if they look to God for guidance, then they see the true way, the true facts. But if they just look to worldly things, then they're always going to be depressed at having to lose something that they've enjoyed that is of a worldly nature. And there's the difference.
Mm-hmm. The very real difference is embracing that change.
Yeah.
And embracing the reality of it.
Yeah. It's just like when my mother was ill. She died of multiple myeloma at age 65. And she was so very ill, but she never complained and she never gave up. And she was bedfast for the last 6 months of her life because her bones were just so fragile because of the illness. But if anyone would ask her how she was, she'd say, I'm just fine. Mm-hmm. And she had that strong spiritual faith. And only God knows what karma she was fulfilling in having to go through with that multiple myeloma. But she did it in such a courageous, beautiful way that whatever she needed to work through, then she did it very, very well.
Mm-hmm. And the disease didn't touch her.
Exactly. Her spirit. Didn't touch her spirit.
Her spirit was at peace.
Yeah.
And as long as the spirit and the soul and the inner being is at peace, what happens to the outer shell isn't of much importance.
It's somewhat irrelevant, and it's totally irrelevant if we look at it that way. As you say, we live in our minds and not in our bodies and not in the world. And if we put this emphasis, it's where we put our emphasis.
Where we put our emphasis and how we condition our minds, how we condition our thought process. If we condition our thought process in such a fashion that it always sees the negative,
Yes.
it always sees the dark side, then every circumstance becomes a tremendous burden. Every burden becomes a tremendous burden. Where if we choose to think in a different way and think in terms of the fact that the circumstances and situations are simply challenges, opportunities for growth, an idea to do something in a different way, then we move on.
We need to look to the changes for the positive aspect, not for the ways to defeat us. And we'll see those positive aspects if we look, because they're always there.
Absolutely, and there is great good undergirding and supporting us at every level of our life. Many times we are faced with the reality that we don't have enough funds. We look for prosperity, and certainly people in our movement are very prosperity conscious. But when we don't have enough, when there is limit or there's lack, we have great consolation in the fact that not only is there abundance, but because we have lack and because we have limit, we have had the need for the funds that we're raising. So there is a great strength in having bills because we know that we have something for those bills. We have a house, we have electricity, we have food, we have a car, and so those bills become a blessing. And if the payment of those bills becomes a curse, if you will, because we don't have enough abundant supply, then by getting connected with the power of God in our lives and in our minds, we'll be directed to do the things that we need to meet our abundance. But the limit really brings to our consciousness the blessing that we have.
Yes, and we might look to life to see what changes we need to make in our lives in order to embrace these new things that are coming in, whether it's less funds in our pocket or whatever the changes are, to see how those changes can work in a positive way toward our good and toward the good we can give out to the world.
and know that in the midst of everything, good is operating.
Right.
And Nora Brooks, who is the foundress of Divine Science and was a student of Christian Science in the early days, was a great expounder on the fact of the goodness of God. And Charles Fillmore, Myrtle Fillmore, and all of the movement are just totally immersed in the reality of good and God as being synonymous, that we have good everywhere, and that we need to see the good in the midst of every circumstance.
And we can see that good if we just look. And instead of looking down, to look up. And I have a friend who once lived at a Christian retreat, and when the people were leaving, they would be sad to leave, and she would say, look up. And she wouldn't say the word, she would just do this, motion to look up. And that motioned people to look up, and their hearts were light because as they were leaving, as opposed to their hearts being heavy as they were leaving. So that would be one way we could remind ourselves to just look up to God, look up to God the whole.
When we move out of one experience, it opens up a tremendous vista for a new experience to come.
Yeah.
When one relationship ends, it is the place for another to come in.
Yes. And we never know what lies ahead. We just have to use, and we know that our faith will be justified. That's the point, that having the faith to know that our faith will be justified.
Mm-hmm. Our faith is that good is everywhere and that good will sustain us.
Yeah. It's a wonderful thing to know that we can look to God at any moment, and most people do, and those people who are happy, healthy, and strong do look to God at any moment.
We look to God in all of our needs, and Reverend Freelander and I have been sharing with you ideas of confident living, and we invite you to embrace the changes in your life with great joy and happiness because they're gifts from God. We look forward to seeing you next time.
Visions of value, the kingdom at hand. Confident living, talent to win. Gift of the Spirit moves from within.